Hi, I'm Gordon from Camera Labs, and this is my review of the Sigma 300 to 600mm f4 DG-OS, a bright aperture super telephoto zoom lens aimed at high-end sports and wildlife photographers. At the time I made this review, it's available in Sony E and L mounts and costs around $6,000 or pounds. Now that's obviously a lot of money, but it's actually a relative bargain compared to the 600mm f4 primes that it goes up against, as they can cost over double that. Yep, $13,000 for Sony or Canon's latest 600 f4 lenses, while Nikon's version with a built-in teleconverter will set you back $15,000. So not only does Sigma's lens give you a 600mm f4 at less than half the price of Sony and Canon, but it can also zoom out to 300mm, giving you greater flexibility than a fixed prime. Indeed, it could replace the 300, 400, 500 and 600, at least if having f4 at all of those focal lengths is sufficient for your needs. But can it really deliver the same experience and quality of those prime lenses? And what are the gotchas? Let's find out. Announced in February 2025 alongside the 16-300 Super Zoom and the stylish BF camera, they jointly become the first models to sport Sigma's new branding, and like all Sigma products, are made in Japan. Sigma of course has a long history of super telephoto zooms, several of which have also sported bright apertures. Most notably the 120-300 2.8 from 2010 and the ultimate Bigma, the 200-500 2.8 from 2008. But as far as I can recall, no one has attempted a 300-600 f4 so far, and I'd argue that this model also becomes Sigma's most professional lens to date. First things first, measuring 167mm in diameter and 468mm long, the Sigma 300-600 is very similar in size to the latest 600mm f4 primes from say Sony and Canon. But pick it up and it's noticeably heavier, weighing a fraction under 4 kilograms versus a fraction over 3 kilograms for its latest rivals. So it's around 1 kilogram heavier, but to be fair, this is compared to the most recent 600mm f4 primes, as some older versions actually weighed considerably more. And it's also important to remember that the Sigma lens also eliminates the need to carry a 300 f4, which could typically weigh a kilogram by itself, or indeed a 400 and a 500 prime. And don't forget, many sports professionals will be carrying a second body for that second lens too, so for a single lens and single body solution, the Sigma 300-600 isn't actually unreasonable in heft. But I still need to stress that this was one of the heaviest lenses that I've used for a long time, getting on for 5 kilograms with a body and the hood attached. That may not sound like much for the gym bunnies out there, but once you start swinging it around, handheld to follow the action like birds in flight, you're going to feel it. This is a lens that really benefits from a monopod or a tripod for prolonged use. The build quality is excellent though, up there with the best of the pros super telephotos from the big names, and Sigma's first lens to sport a white finish with thermal insulation paint. It is of course sealed from dust and splashes, including a rubber grommet at the mount. Starting closest to the mount is a compartment for drop-in filters measuring 40.5mm. Next comes a bank of 4 switches, including a focus limiter, the optical stabilization mode, and a custom switch. Sigma claims 5.5 stops of compensation from the optical stabilization. On the opposite side of the barrel is a switch to set the outermost control ring between motorized power focusing or jumping to a preset distance, while above it are a switch for a confirmation beep and a button to lock in that focusing distance, and I'm going to demo this later. Next comes the built-in collar, which allows the lens to rotate by 360 degrees when mounted on a tripod with a generous knurled knob to lock it in position. The collar is also where you'll find a pair of strap mounts, as like other super telephotos you should be supporting the lens, not the camera. Impressively, the tripod collar not only has 4 clicked positions to help you quickly find 90-degree intervals, but a switch underneath to declick it and allow free spinning. This is the first time I've seen this, and it's so nice to choose between free or clicked rotation, as they are suitable for different types of subjects. Meanwhile, like other big Sigma lenses, the tripod foot already includes an Arca-Swiss dovetail, allowing it to slide straight into a compatible clamp. In contrast, Sony, Canon and most others force you to buy a third-party replacement foot if you'd like this functionality. That said, if you do prefer a different base, you can also remove Sigma's foot for a different model. Like other super telephotos, it's possible to use the foot as a carrying handle, and bonus points to Sigma for considerately padding the other side, making it more comfortable to hold. Next comes a generously wide manual focusing ring, which spins freely and smoothly. The closest focusing distance at 300mm is 2.8 meters, or 4.5 meters when set to 600mm. After this is the zoom ring, easy to hold at 6 centimeters wide and providing enough friction to stay at the selected focal length. Notice how the zooming is internal, unlike Sigma's other current super telephotos which typically have extending barrels. This makes the 300 to 600 feel much better balanced and quicker to respond. After the zoom ring comes a twisting control ring with two different functions using that switch near the mount. Set to power focus and it will offer two different motorized focus speeds, which can be nice for smooth focus pulls in video. Here's how it looks smoothly racking focus while recording. It can look pretty good, but it's also easy to overshoot your target at such long focal lengths and large apertures, so you may need several attempts to nail it. Set it to preset distance though, and you can save a specific focusing distance, then use a twist of the control ring to return it almost instantly. This allows you to preset the focus on, say, a football net or a bird's nest or perch, safe in the knowledge that you can snap back to it at any time with a quick twist. You can see it here snapping onto the bottle, which I'd saved as a preset focus distance. Now, we have seen this kind of functionality on other super telephoto prime lenses and it can certainly be very useful, but I did find it a bit odd that only one distance could be programmed on this lens given the ring could be twisted in either direction. Maybe that's something they can add in a firmware update. Then just before the barrel expands to house the front elements, you'll find 4 custom buttons at 90-degree intervals. These all perform the same custom function, normally focus hold by default. Sigma supplies a large cylindrical lens hood, 165mm long by itself, which slides over the end of the barrel with a locking screw to hold it in place. Like most super telephotos, this is rubber tipped, allowing you to securely stand the lens upside down on the ground. The lens is also supplied with a material-based lens cap. Check Sigma's website for details on the supplied and optional accessories. Like most pro super telephotos, Sigma supplies the 300-600 with a well-padded case with shoulder straps that let you wear it as a backpack. There's pockets and straps on either side to accommodate tripods, monopods or other accessories. There's also just about enough room to mount a body on the end of the lens while it's in the pack, but I don't think this is recommended practice. Instead, I'd sooner keep the body separated during transportation, and there is room to squeeze it in the top of the bag if desired. Okay, now for the range, which takes you from 300mm to 600mm, which includes the classic focal lens that are popular with most sports and wildlife photographers. In theory, this single lens could replace a 300, 400, 500 and 600, so long as the f4 aperture is going to be sufficient for your needs. This makes the Sigma lens very convenient, but there are 3 gotchas to be aware of. First, the 300-600 zoom is not parfocal, which means that it may lose focus briefly if you adjust the zoom during a continuous burst. This could limit you if your subject is, say, approaching quickly and you're adjusting the zoom to keep it framed as desired. If you're likely to zoom during a burst, you'll be better served by something like a Sony 200-600 or 400-800, both of which also have lighter and short throw rings designed for this kind of operation, not to mention dimmer apertures that are less demanding. So rather than zooming during bursts, I typically adjusted the focal length between bursts on the Sigma. In this way I treated it more like having a series of primes rather than a zoom lens, and still remains way faster to switch between them than picking up a second body or swapping lenses. Ultimately though, it will depend on your subject and use case though. The second limitation regards teleconverters. If you have the E-mount version for Sony bodies, you cannot use it with Sony's own teleconverters on a Sony body, and sadly Sigma doesn't make E-mount teleconverters of its own. I believe this may be a licensing restriction. Now there's no issues or workarounds needed with the L-mount version though, with the 300-600 working just fine with Sigma's own teleconverters for that system. That said, 600mm is already pretty long and most modern bodies already offer plenty of resolution for cropping, so the inability to use teleconverters on Sony's may not actually be that big of an issue. The third limitation regards burst speeds again on the E-mount version, as Sony still annoyingly limits all third-party lenses to 15 frames per second when using continuous AFC. So while it may be possible to shoot at 120 frames per second with the 300-600 on, say, an A9 III body, it's only available in single AFS mode, which isn't particularly useful for sports, wildlife or action. Clearly this is Sony protecting its system and only allowing their own lenses to work with TCs and above 15 frames per second, so this is a limitation that you'll need to weigh up for yourself. Again, there's no such limitation for L-mount owners, as the L-mount version of the 300-600 will work just fine with the 40 frames per second top speed of the Panasonic Lumix S1R Mark II, and that's the combination that I've used for my tests. Note you may also be able to bypass both the burst and teleconverter restrictions when adapting the E-mount version to a different system. For example, Polish photographer Dariusz Bress has published a number of tests with the Sigma lens coupled with Sony teleconverters on Nikon Z bodies using the Megadapt Pro adapter, and they seem to focus fine while also supporting the top burst speeds on those bodies. Nice work. Okay, now for my focusing test, starting with the lens at 300mm f4 near to its closest focusing distance, and again all my tests were made with a Lumix S1R2 body. Here you can see the combination hunting briefly at times with this particular subject and distance, but the actual focus pull itself is very swift. And now again at 600mm f4, again near to the closest focusing distance, where the racking speed is similar, but the performance looks more confident here with less hunting. As mentioned earlier, you can preset a focusing distance and snap straight to it with a twist of the control ring near the end of the barrel. Great for quickly returning to, say, a bird's perch or a sports goal. It can also work well for video. Here I have the autofocus area set to the background, but can immediately switch back to the preset distance of the bottle in the foreground with a twist of the control ring if desired. Very handy, although it could be even better with two different presets controlled by twisting the ring in opposite directions. Okay, now for the optical quality, starting with a distant real-life subject and angled so that details run into the corners. You're looking at the lens at 300mm f4 here, and taking a close look in the middle shows very fine details out of the gate. Closing the aperture may give a mild impression of the image becoming a tad sharper, but this is actually more likely to be down to the depth of field becoming more forgiving. So back to the f4 sample before heading into the far corner, where again the details remain very crisp with no evidence of softening. Again, if I close the aperture, you may notice a fractional improvement, but again, I'd say this is more down to the depth of field. So now for the lens at the long end of the range at 600mm f4, where the depth of field and heat rising can become magnified for a subject at this distance, but let's take a close look in the middle anyway. And here you'll see the lens delivering very crisp details right out of the gate. Stopping down can boost the overall sharpness of this subject, but again, that's more of a depth of field adjustment that you're seeing. So back to the f4 sample before heading into the far corner, where again the details remain very crisp without any issues to report. Closing the aperture here again is more about adjusting the depth of field. I also tested the lens at 400 and 500mm with similar results, where the details were sharp right across the frame at the maximum aperture. It really is an excellent performer optically. Okay, so how about a closer subject, such as at a portrait distance? Here's a couple of quick shots with the lens starting at 300mm f4, where you can see the potential for background blur. And now at 600mm f4, to be fair, not exactly practical for most human subjects, but I just wanted to show you anyway. Note those weird looking bokeh blobs in the background were down to harsh reflections on the windscreens of parked cars behind me. With less harsh conditions, the rendering, as you'll see in my following samples, can actually look very nice. So first, here's my bokeh ball test, reframed to accommodate the long focal lengths and more distant minimum focusing distances, starting here at 300mm f4, where you can see the bokeh balls are well behaved with minimal outlining or textures within. Closing the aperture to f5.6 renders most of the blobs as more uniform circles, while at f8 you'll notice the diaphragm system nicely keeping out of the way. So now here's how it looks at 600mm f4, again from the closest focusing distance, and rendering nice looking blobs without any obvious issues. Closing down one stop, again renders them mostly as circles across the frame, and one stop further shows the lens is still avoiding a geometric aperture opening. Let's see some more examples at the kind of typical distances the lens will be used, where you can see the potential for shallow depth of field effects. Of course, the greatest impact will be when shooting at 600mm f4, where the depth of field can be razor thin for dramatic results and very clear separation. At 300mm f4, there's unsurprisingly less potential for blurring, but it's still pretty respectable, and again saves you from lugging around a separate lens and possibly a second body for it. The question is whether f4 is going to be sufficient for you at this end of the range. Okay, now it's time for my verdict, during which I'll show you some more images taken with the lens, particularly a bunch of bursts from the S1R2 body at its top electronic and mechanical burst speeds. The Sigma 300-600mm f4 is a remarkable lens in terms of flexibility, price and performance. It starts by giving you a 600mm f4 at roughly half the price of those from Sony, Canon and Nikon, already making it tremendous value. It then gives you the chance to zoom out to 300mm, giving you greater flexibility than a traditional prime, and best of all in my test, the optical quality was superb, delivering crisp details throughout the range and across the frame, wide open at f4. The build quality and feature set are also excellent, including a tripod collar that can be clicked or declicked, and an Arca dovetail carved right into the foot, neither of which you're going to find from any of the big names. So what's not to like? Well, most obviously it is a very heavy lens, roughly 4 kilograms alone, or around 5 when fitted with the hood and mounted on a body. That makes it around 1 kilogram heavier than the most recent 600mm f4 lenses from the big names, although it should again be noted that some earlier versions of these lenses were actually heavier, and of course with the Sigma you're getting a zoom that could replace multiple primes, and they will add up to a heavier weight. Secondly, it's not parfocal, which means the focus needs to be adjusted as you zoom. This can be an issue if you're shooting a subject that's approaching quickly while adjusting the zoom to reframe. In those situations, you may lose focus temporarily, so it's best to treat the Sigma zoom as a series of primes instead and just set your focal length before each burst. Third are the restrictions that Sony enforces on third-party lenses, namely a top burst speed of 15 frames per second when using continuous autofocus and incompatibility with their teleconverters. Of course, this only affects the E-mount version of the lens when mounted on a Sony body, and I personally feel that the range is sufficient without teleconverters on a modern high-res camera for most circumstances, but the 15 frames per second burst limit is harder to swallow for action shooters, especially if they've invested in a Sony body that offers 30 to 120 frames per second when using Sony's own lenses. L-mount owners, or those adapting the E-mount version to other systems though, needn't worry, with the lens supporting faster bursts and in the case of the L-mount, working with Sigma's own teleconverters. Indeed, for L-mount owners, it becomes by far the best high-end super telephoto lens to date. To be fair, the only one so far, but for E-mount there are alternatives to consider. Perhaps most compelling, for much the same money as the Sigma Zoom, you could alternatively get Sony's 300mm f2.8 G Master and enjoy not just its brighter aperture at 300mm and lighter weight, but support for both the fastest bursts and Sony's teleconverters. Fit a 1.4 times TC and you could have a 420mm f4 prime, matching the Sigma aperture. But at 600mm with a 2 times TC you would be working at f5.6. Now you'd still have the fast bursts, but with optics that are one stop slower, no chance to fine tune the focal length with a zoom, and of course the delay when fitting those teleconverters. But then if you are hiking with the lens to reach a distant subject, it's going to be a lot easier to accommodate weight-wise. Ultimately, you need to ask yourself first if you'd exploit the flexibility of a zoom, and whether you need f4 at 600mm, and equally whether f4 is going to be sufficient at 300mm. Then you have to factor in if you need a parfocal zoom, and in particular if the restrictions on Sony bodies are going to be deal breakers or not. But regardless, Sigma has really shaken up the super telephoto end of the market by delivering not just a uniquely flexible high-end lens, but one that substantially undercuts traditional big primes on price while still boasting excellent performance. It's Sigma's most professional lens to date, and one that will open up the joy of bright super telephoto photography to a much broader audience. And that marks the end of another review, and as always, if you found any of it useful, I'd really appreciate you consider giving the video a like and my channel a follow, as both really genuinely help, especially in the absence of having a sponsor on every single review. Let me know what you think in the comments. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time. Bye bye.